Is that shadow on the wall a projection of you, or are you a projection of it? I'm Ray Myers. Welcome to Craft vs. Cruft. And in today's installment of Advent of DSLs, we're going to cover creating projectional DSLs with coding agents. So this is somewhat esoteric. Thank you for joining me for it. I think you will find it a treat. This is one example of AI applied to language engineering, which is kind of a subfield of computer science that's related to compilers and other programming language tooling, often for domain-specific languages. So we are going to cover domain-specific languages. The situation we're in is on a small but advanced hobby project of mine. And on that, I'm going to show how I'm in this one introduction of a feature using AI coding agents very heavily while preserving quality. So what are domain-specific languages? I've done a few videos on this, but if you are anywhere near programming, you've used a number of them. SQL is one. Regular expressions is one. These are ones just used in programming, but you also have spreadsheet languages like Microsoft Excel. So it's either applied to a business domain or a specific type of problem, and it gives you this very constrained and optimized language to express those ideas. An example that programmers are often familiar with is the Mermaid diagramming tool. So this is a demo from Mermaid's website, and you can see on the left, someone is able to type in code that describes this sequence diagram they want to create, and on the right, it's making the diagram. So we get a nicely formatted diagram of the right type, but we also get code that we can version control and maintain the diagrams the same way we think of maintaining source code. I really like diagrams as code tools. Mermaid's a great one. I also like D2. So these diagrams as code, DSLs, generally work by you type code into an editor and it is generated into a diagram, right? A projectional DSL is a little different. It has not only multiple views, multiple editable views. Usually these are code and visual, but this could play out in any number of ways. So you have that same, panes that you looked at before, where you've got code and you've got the visual representation, and a user can edit the code, but a user can also edit directly on the diagram, on the other view. Any change on one side is replicated to the other. You are changing the underlying model. There isn't just the one first-class representation you get to edit. It's incredibly powerful to have this option, but very few tools provide it. There are specialized tools called language workbenches, like MPS and the newer Freon, that optimize the creation of these kinds of editing environments because they are non-trivial to implement. That's why there aren't very many of them, even though they're so nice. So this is my little diagramming tool I made a couple years back. It's for theory of constraints diagrams. If you've ever seen the business novel The Goal, that was what introduced theory of constraints. This area of thinking, it's like a systems thinking paradigm, and it's got a bunch of different special diagrams people draw. I wanted to make it easier for developers to work with these diagrams, so I made this little thing called TOC-lang. TOC, you see, is short for theory of constraints. So every once in a while, I come back and add a feature or maintain it otherwise, and of late, coding agents have been pretty helpful. So this is the interface we're talking about. There's several different sub-languages for different kinds of diagrams. This one is a diagram called the evaporating cloud. It's an example that I got from Steve Tenen. It's not important really for right now what the example is. Basically, this is meant to analyze apparent conflicts. The insight that's supposed to come out of this analysis is we think that in order to subordinate all decisions to the financial goal, we must subordinate people's needs to the financial goal. But the discovery is there's a way to break that down, and we don't have to subordinate people's needs just to make the decisions align the way they want. Now, something that I noticed when using this is that I always had to go to the code in order to edit, but usually I'm looking at the diagram when I want to edit. This is the classic issue that projectional editors were created for, right? So what I wanted to do was to add this little edit button, be able to trigger edit mode, and then I could click on the one that I wanted to change. And let's say instead of the word subordinate, I want to use the word align. So we could just change the wording there and apply it. And you notice the key part here is it changes in both places, both in the diagram and in the source code. That is the experience that we want. I've noticed it's been very instructive for us to show each other exactly how we're using coding agents in a real situation. The rest of this video is going to walk through my exact process for implementing that feature using openhands. I found that it has been very instructive for people to learn from each other. How are we using these coding agents? How are we keeping them on track, getting the most value out of them, preserving quality, all that good stuff. So hopefully you find this valuable. I should mention, in case you're not already aware, I do work for the company that makes openhands, but I'm not really trying to sell it to you right now. Everything that I'm going to show ought to be pretty applicable to other leading agents in the space. I'm going to show you exactly what I did using screenshots, but just so you can see kind of the animated version of what this looks like. If I were to pull up my project here, I could launch an openhands session. So we could pop out a code editor, or we could just talk to it. And I might often say something like bump the oldest dependency. So it's going to go off and run many steps, try things, and if it completes successfully, I'll be able to create a pull request here often, as I did here. So that's kind of the workflow, and it's a fairly simple task. It might just finish it in one shot, but we're going to see in a more elaborate one what the different kind of sub-steps were. So from here on, this is exactly what I did. I started a new conversation using my existing TOC-lang repository and gave exactly this prompt. Create new branch, GUI edit, and add a control to the right panel next to export that toggles editing of the diagram. We will cover what it does after we make it. I just wanted to add a button first off. I'm using pretty small prompts here, but it has become trendy to go through a pre-discovery process and create this very long, detailed prompt. And that's also worth exploring. I just don't happen to be doing that now. I'm doing this more iteratively. So it is creating several steps that it is going to go through in its little task manager. It's going to explore the code base, try to figure out where this thing's supposed to go. It's going to add it. It's going to try and run a browser and test it. Ultimately, was successful in doing that. I saw the button, and so I'm giving it the next step. Whenever you see these gray boxes, this is what I am saying in the conversation. That's the user message. So I say when edit is on, then it should show a pencil icon by all the node labels. Consider showing by setting edit mode as a class on a whole container. So I'm indicating, and I actually moved back from this later. You noticed in the final version, I didn't use the pencil icon, but I am saying, okay, this is what I want it to look like when you do that. And I say consider. You might use this way to implement it, a CSS class. So my intention here is I've got an intuition for what might be a good way, and that's why I'm saying consider. I'm not saying do it this way. Depending on how sure I am, I might do one or the other. So it's saying I did it, yada, yada, and I'm saying, okay, that's a good start, and just giving it some notes on how I might want it to be displayed differently. And I say follow conventions, hoping that it will be able to channel some just sort of normal design. That often works well. In this case, it didn't work very well, probably because I'm doing something unusual and having a GUI in the middle of this SVG canvas, but neither here nor there. So it comes back and say, yeah, I've done the things you asked, and I'm, for the moment, happy with how it looks. Now I start to get into a more detailed prompt. Now let's think about the functionality of editing the labels. This will be a projectional editor, so when a label is updated in the GUI, it should update the code. Let's build the back end of that first, test-driven. I recognize you, the viewer, aren't familiar with this code base, so unless you have worked a lot with this kind of tech, this is not all going to make sense, but these are implementation hints that I think will come in handy. I'm starting from what is the smallest useful part in the back end that we'd be able to independently test and build out from there. That is my intuition here. So this is what I said. Let's build the back end first, test-driven, capability to tell the source location. Consider augmenting the parsing process with something like a label range on the ST. Ranges have a start and an end, which are source locations. Make a type for that. When that's tested in passing, add backend capability to update label by node ID with tests. So I'm reminding it several times that I want it to make automated tests for what it's doing. And I'm also introducing the idea that we're going to need more information on the parsed tree than we have now. We're going to need to preserve where in the source file did it find these nodes that it's parsing. I just have background knowledge that when you're doing refactoring tools, you often want that. So that's where I'm telling it to start, and this will enable us to create this update label thing, which will do that deterministic update of the source file. And at the end, I know there are multiple parsers for the different diagram types. So that's what's going through my mind as I was writing that, but this isn't like a detailed spec. It was just kind of off the cuff. So it goes ahead and it does a lot based on that, a lot of activity. Come back later, and it has identified it's encountering some difficulties. This is what it says is the problem. I'm trying to modify PeggyJs grammar, which is the parsing library I'm using, to capture precise locations for label text. But the grammar change broke existing functionality, and it provides several options. We could use post-processing, we could use an alternate grammar approach, or option C, we could use string-based location tracking. So I glanced at that and I suggested option A because I thought that was going to do what I wanted. It announced the new test it had created passed, and I asked, does the full test suite pass? And it runs them all and says, oh yeah, the full test suite didn't pass. So this is the sort of thing. Now, ideally, I wouldn't have to ask a coding agent this. It would understand that I always want it to run the full test suite. You can try to prompt for that, or you can use a pre-commit hook. But generally, I think the integration with your desired dev process is something the user has to still bring to the table a lot of the time. Anyway, it quickly discovers, oh yeah, there's some existing tests failing because it's testing sort of the full parse tree that's coming out of the parsers. And so if you add data to that structurally, it's going to make the test fail for really no good reason. So you have to clarify, yeah, in this case, I want you to get them passing, but I'm okay with you updating it for this reason. That's fine. I'm having to kind of manage like, okay, is the code what's wrong now, or is the test what needs updating? With that, I was able to figure it out. And now I say, you've got the backend capability. Now we know that works. You can use that now to make that user interface for editing actually edit the labels. It went ahead and reported success on that, and I told it go ahead and push to branch. I checked it out locally and ran it and looked at it. I said, okay, this is pretty good. I'm poking around at it, and it is basically doing what we asked. But I did notice something, which was that if the label in the code was in quotes, editing it would actually remove the quotes. You're allowed to have quotes in this DSL, but I decided to say, okay, if we're editing it, let's just say we're going to include quotes by default. I would rather have them be there than have this remove them. So it did make that change. I pulled it down and found another issue. I said, okay, there's a case where I was able to do an edit that broke it. The situation was there was a block after the element being edited and the open brace got deleted. So I wanted to fix that and put in a test. And kind of as an afterthought, I also say, if you'd been using source ranges correctly, like we talked about, I don't think this bug would have happened. So whatever the fix, try to make it systemic. Because I was realizing that the design direction I had given it should have made that kind of bug not happen. I'm a little confused here, and I'm noting, I better look at this when I look at the pull request and see if this is really being done how I think it is. All right, so the bug was fixed, and this is when I decide, let's get rid of the pencil icon. Instead, let's indicate editability with a pointer when mousing over a label in edit mode. Clicking the label is what starts the edit. And right now we have the edit and the export button right next to each other. Let's put the export on the far right. That's where I'd expect it. So it does that, and we're getting close to a ready PR, so I start looking through the code by hand. I say, I notice in this function, you are doing regular expression parsing, and that's brittle. We're using PeggyJs for the parsing, so you should be able to make the test pass by using those capabilities and not by making your own regex, right? So it goes off and does that. It comes back with one failing test, And I say in this case, it's probably fine for the test to update. Just in the name of show, don't tell, this is one of those functions, add source location tracking, where I thought it was doing something that was duplicating the grammar rather than using the existing parser properly. So in that interaction, this is what I was trying to get it to get away from. So then we're complete, and I say, okay, great. Push if the tests are green. And again, it's like, I guess they weren't green. And this is because it has added this label range property to the nodes. And so the AST structure has changed, and we've got tests that are around sort of that exact output. Above is what it looks like now. Below is what the tests are expecting. So I'm thinking that's fine. We can just update the tests. But I'm also thinking those tests don't really have much to do with the label range. Might be better just to test that in one place and not have that be present at all in all these other, approval tests that have the expected AST. So I suggest in gray here, you can say, what about making a strip locations util for tests so tests can be independent of the ranges, and just leaving the ones like this that are testing the range functionality itself. And, as agents using Claude are so prone to do, it's saying that's an excellent idea. It flatters any idea you give it, and it struggles with that for a little bit. It seems like that doesn't completely solve the problem, so I say, okay, just update the tests that need to be updated with the new field. It also occurs to me that it might be hand editing these results every time, but this approval testing library that I'm using saves received values in a particular text file. There are fast ways to update it just by copying the received file to the approved file if what you want to do is accept them. So I'm giving it a hint about that. That is a good example of advice that I would later add to an agent's MD file so that it would just be already there for any agent to use. Anyway, so at the end of this, we've got this PR that, implements that one seemingly simple feature that does span the code base. We have 9 commits, 22 files changed, and I'm pretty happy with the result. So I start a fresh conversation in the same repo and say, review this PR number for quality, styles, conventions, testing, and it's going to look through the diff. You notice I'm not really giving it a lot of detail on what the quality guidelines in this context might be or anything. I'm just seeing what it finds. In, a more established situation, it would be recommended to give it a lot more detail, save that to a file maybe for it to refer to, of how it ought to go about reviewing PRs, use other kinds of metrics. And I am not using this as a complete substitute for my looking at it, right? This is just for the things my eyes don't catch. What does it find? It likes the architecture, it likes the testing, it notices that there's a bunch of lint errors and some front-end issues that don't particularly interest me right now because the front end is very bare bones anyway. So I could just run these commands, but I'm pasting into the old conversation npm run lint fix commit push. It just sets kind of instructions, and it goes and does that, and I've got something that I merged. Now, I believe this was using Claude Sonnet 4.5 model behind the scenes. This is the openhands agent around the time of the V1 switch, and this is a fairly long conversation. This was sort of checking back in with it throughout the afternoon today. The total cost was almost $20. If you're interested in such things, it used a total of over 30 million LLM tokens, but most of those were cached. And interestingly, although we have a 1 million token context window on this, we are not near hitting it. We're at under 50,000 tokens of context window because although it's a very long conversation, our condensation handles that pretty well. The total cost was around $20 for one long session. However, this would have taken me a long time to do, and I didn't want to do it. So I was actually pretty happy to have paid that in this case. It did what I wanted it to do, and it was something that I had put off. So I was actually pretty happy with that nonetheless, even if it weren't the vendor that I work for. With similar sized tasks, I have paid similar amounts to other agents out of my pocket. I think But your mileage may vary. And if I had spent that amount of time and wasn't happy with the result, then I probably wouldn't be very happy spending $20. So food for thought. I think we need to continue making it easier to use these things effectively. From this session, what were my observations? I felt that it was totally worth it in this case because it would have just been harder than it looks to get that all going on my own. I had been putting it off for a long time. Now I've got a pattern that'll let me add more and more projectional editing features to this, and I'll see how far the agents get me on that. It was nonetheless a bit finicky. I showed you all of the times where it stumbled. I had to start it back. And tests, right? The existing automated tests in the repo and the new ones that are being added, these were absolutely essential for me to be confident in the progress. And you notice I used my own architectural knowledge of this code base to both suggest implementations I thought would work and to get it unstuck. So I'd be very cautious of the notion that these coding agents replace our need to understand what's going on. Something I definitely should have done, and I did right after that session actually, is add an agents.md to the repo so that it would have, a little map, lay of the land. That could have helped it operate more efficiently and probably avoided some of the stumbles that it had. And I definitely observed that it's not very well integrated into what we could call the SDLC, right? The software development lifecycle. I'm talking about things like it's not immediately knowing to push when I want it to push. It's not always running all the tests when I would expect it to run all the tests. And there's all sorts of little things like this. And so I think we need to continue to highlight, how are we going to make it very intuitive to configure it so it acts in the way that fits your context. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I would love it if you'd like to subscribe or comment with what you'd like to hear about next. As it's said in the Tao Te Ching, with patience, the most tangled cord may be undone. Thank you.